Hey, what's up everybody? I'd like to welcome you to another Juice tutorial. And today's a very exciting tutorial in that this is going to be the first one where we're going to actually work to generate some audio output. Now, the output that we're going to generate is just going to be some random white noise. But I think what we could do is we could focus on this tutorial about the ways that the things that we need to think about in order to generate audio output within Juice, because there are a couple things that we need to be aware of and a couple things that we need to do. Now, one thing that I'm going to emphasize here is that, as I've said a couple times before, I'm learning Juice myself. And one thing that I found through the past couple of days looking through, the tutorial and looking through the documentation was, there are a lot of different aspects. And I would compare it to an onion, that you get kind of your surface level knowledge base, just to get things kind of working. And then as you get more and more experience, you can kind of peel back that onion and learn more and get more involved with some other aspects of the class, in this case the audio app component class, because I found that there were some things that I didn't quite understand, couldn't quite get my head around, but I think that those things will just kind of come with experience and practice. And so I'm just going to try to dive in the best that I can, explain things the best that I can, and I hope that you can as well. Okay, so as always, we're going to generate a new project. Okay, and this is going to be a little bit different in that we're going to generate an audio application rather than a GUI application. Okay, so we're going to click on audio application, and we'll just call this audio out 1. I'm just going to throw this in my development folder. Creates 2 files. We got our main component .cpp and our main Juice .cpp, which gives us our Juice functionality, as we've said before. So just going to open that up in Xcode now, and here we are. So this main component .cpp, so this is very similar to the GUI application that we did in the past, except it's going to have some additional things that we need to go over. Okay, first thing that's different is that if you look in the class here, we can see that it is actually inheriting from the audio app component class rather than just the regular component class where we were generating sliders and dials and whatnot. Okay, and what this does is this allows us to use some different functions for actually generating input and output within Juice. Okay, if we go to our constructor, then we have set size. We've gone through that. Then we have this function set audio channels. It's automatically set it for 2 and 2, so that's 2 inputs and 2 outputs, and we can see that if we command click in there. And just look at where I'm losing my head here. Where our constructor is, we got number of input channels, number of output channels. Okay, so we'll do tutorials a little bit later on inputting sound and processing that. And in our destructor, we have the shutdown audio function, and so that's just when our application shuts down the audio. Okay, pretty self-explanatory. Now, these next 3 functions are these are pure virtual functions that need to be called anytime that we're inheriting from the audio app component class. Okay, pure virtual functions, which means that we need to actually call them. We don't need to actually put anything inside of them. It's just that if we're inheriting from them, then they need to be called and they need to be declared. Okay, so first one is prepare to play. So my understanding of this is that this happens once when the application is started. Okay, samples per block expected is buffer. I'm going to assume that you know what a buffer is, so I'm not going to go into that. And then the sample rate. Now, it's getting these numbers from the sound card. I think that if we wanted to, we could change those numbers. We can change the buffer size and the sample rate within this block here if we needed to. Somebody tell me if I'm wrong about that. Okay. So the next one is the most important one, get next audio block. Okay. Now, this is where we're going to do our audio processing today. Now, we have this we have this object here called audio source channel info. I'll come back to that in a minute. Then we have this final function, release resources. This is when the audio device stops. Okay. Then we have paint and resize functions, which we've gone through before. Okay. Now going back to audio source channel info. Okay, because this is kind of where the meat of everything happens, and where one thing that I'll say is that this. I don't know if I said it before, but the audio app component class, I've spent the last couple days kind of going through it and reading through the documentation and everything. And it is kind of a winding kind of, to me, it's a little bit, confusing, but I think it's just because it's a new thing for me. And we have, so we have this audio source channel info object here. So if we just go into our documentation here, okay, and then this will kind of help us, figure out what we need to do. Okay. So audio source channel info. Okay. It doesn't really give us a description in here, but the way that I understand it is that this is where we get all of our information about the buffer, where our write buffer is, if we want to write values into our buffer, if we want to get how large our buffer is, then we can get that information from this class. Okay. Also, like the number of channels. So we're in stereo today. We have 2 outputs. So we're in stereo. So this audio source channel info, the way that I understand it is, this is where we get all of our information about the buffer channel, number of channels that we're running, so on and so forth. Okay. So now that we're going to go in here, I'm just going to erase all of this. Okay. And I'm just going to follow along. Oh, my keyboard died. Hopefully it comes back here. 1 second. Oh, here we go. Yeah, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna generate some audio output, and this is following along roughly with the Juce tutorial on generating audio output. Okay, but what I want to do is, rather than just as usual, just kind of going through it and just kind of glossing through and saying, here's this and here's this, I want us to kind of think through the process, think about what we're actually doing. And then, I think with repetition and with practice, this is something that we can, that will just become kind of secondhand nature as we do it more. Okay. So when we're looking to fill a buffer, okay, we have 2 channels. Now, the way that I understand it is that when you're writing into a buffer, you have one buffer between 2 channels. So the first value of the buffer goes to the left channel, or channel 0, and then the second value goes to the right-hand channel, or channel 1. Okay, and then it just goes back and forth, filling each speaker with sound. Okay, so the way that I understand it is that the first thing that we need to do is actually go through and iterate over each channel. Okay, so this is a little bit, this is one of those things that's like, well, how would I know that if I wasn't following this tutorial? And the answer is, to be honest, I don't know. It's just something that, I think we just have to learn with experience and just practice. Okay, so we're going to do a for loop. Okay, I'm sure that if any of you have done anything with sound, you know that you have to iterate through a for loop to fill this buffer. So we're just going to call this channel. Okay, so we got to iterate through each channel. So we've got 2 channels, and then so what we got to do is we got to find out, okay, well, how many channels do we have? Okay, so we've got this audio source channel info. Okay, so we're going to go with this object buffer to fill. Okay. Now, let me go to the documentation, okay, and show you what we got here. So we got, if you look in here, you've got a buffer pointer, okay. So we need to access the buffer, okay, which is, the values that are waiting for us to write our sound into, okay. As you can see that this is a pointer, okay. So we got buffer to fill dot buffer. Okay. Now, okay, we need to get to the channels to iterate through the channels. Okay, so this took a little bit of work to find out. Okay, well, where are these things coming from? Okay, so at the moment we are in audio source channel info, right? Now you've got this audio sample buffer object, right? So let's just click into this class, right? Now this is a little bit confusing because there's a newly created audio buffer class. Right, so you click through there, and then you got to click through here, okay. And now we're in the audio buffer class. Okay, so what we need to do is get the number of channels, right? And here we go, get num channels. Okay, now this is a pointer. Okay, it's not just like a regular object. So here we need to use the arrow operator. Okay, rather than just saying buffer dot get num channels. Okay, it has to be the arrow operator because the buffer is a pointer. Okay, get num channels. Okay, and then we're going to go plus channel. Okay, so just to go through what did I do? Oh, need to capitalize the T. So we've just gotten the number of channels from our buffer. Okay, so we went into our audio source channel info, into the buffer. Okay, and now we want to get, we basically want to iterate between the two channels. Okay, now if I'm not going to do it, but what did I do here? Let me just run it, compile it, see if it runs. Undeclared identifier channel. Oh, I forgot to put int here. Okay, so if I were to console out here over what channel is, it would just go back and forth between 0 and 1. Okay, so we don't need to do that. Let's just move on. Okay, cool. So now we need to create a pointer to base. So now we have a buffer. We have a buffer pointer. Okay, so now we need to point into the actual address of that to actually write our value into. Okay, so we're going to create a pointer, a float pointer, and we're just going to call this buffer. Okay, and so now we need to make this buffer. So now we need to get to the actual location of the actual first location of the buffer, the first index of the buffer. Okay, so we need buffer to fill dot. So we need to go back into the buffer. Okay, I'm glad I'm going through this with you. Okay, so now we need to get to. So now we've gone into the buffer. Now we need to go and get into the actual first index of the buffer. Okay, so we're going to use this one, get right pointer. Okay, so what we're doing is we're just going to go to the very first index in our buffer. Okay, so get right pointer. Okay, now the channel number is just the channel that we're iterating over. Okay, the sample index, so we need to go to the first index in our buffer, right? So we need buffer to fill dot. Okay, now if we just look here, we're lucky because what we need right here is this is what we need right here, start sample. Okay, that goes to the first index of our buffer. Okay, so like I said before, a bit confusing, a bit kind of windy, but this is just something that I think we just have to practice over and just repeat over and over again. And as we repeat it, we'll get the hang of it. Okay, so we've gone through, so now we've gone through the channels. We've created a buffer pointer, okay, that's pointing to the first the first index of our buffer. So now we need to iterate through the buffer itself and be able to write our random values into it. Okay, so we're going to do another for loop. I'm going to call this, I'll call it index equals 0. Our index has to be, so if we're thinking about our buffer size, so it needs to be less, so what we need to iterate through is less than the size of our actual buffer. Okay, so we got buffer to fill dot, here we go, num samples. Okay, so we're going, so the first one we went through the channel, we wrote a pointer that points to the first to the first index in our buffer. Now we're iterating through the buffer itself, and we want to make sure that we don't go outside of the buffer size. So that's why we have buffer to fill dot num samples. Okay, maybe I should call this samples rather than I'll call this sample rather than index to keep from confusing you guys. Okay, so we got plus plus sample. Okay, cool. So now we get to the point where we have to actually write the values into the buffer itself. Okay. So we're writing it into the address of buffer, right? So we're writing it into our write pointer. Okay. So we got buffer, and then this sample is going to be our index number of our buffer, okay, because it's iterating through the whole buffer. So equals, okay. So now we just need to generate some random values. Okay, there's an actual random class. Okay. So if we go to random, okay, so this is a class that specializes in generating random numbers. Okay, I think I lost my way here. Let me go back. Great. So we're here in the random class. So that means that we need to create a random object. Okay, we're just going to do it here in private. Just random. Okay. Now, what we need to do is we need to go between if we're generating values that are going into the speakers, well, the values can't go more than +1 or -1, so they need to be values between +1 and -1. Okay, so we're talking about floating point values. Okay, so what we need is this function here, next float. Okay, so we got random. Okay, our random object that we just created, dot next float. Okay, now there's a problem. The problem is that if we look here into next float, okay, returns a random floating point number between 0 and 1. Okay, but we need it to be between -1 and +1. Okay, so we're going to do a little bit of math trickery to actually get it to do that. Okay, so we got 0 to 1. We're going to multiply that by 2. Okay, so that's going to give us a values between +2, 0, and +2. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we're going to subtract 1. Okay, and that's going to give us values now between +1 and -1. Okay. Now, if I do that now, that's going to be very loud because we're obviously going to be going to the full extent of our speakers. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put these in parentheses, and I'm going to multiply this by 0.25. Okay. So what that's going to do, rather than going between +1 and -1, which would, which would be really loud, it's going to go between +25 and plus 0.25 and minus 0.25. Okay. Looks like it didn't like something. What have I done here? Same thing again. Forgot to declare this isn't it. Okay. So we should be cool now. Okay, let's see what happens. Okay, fingers crossed we did everything right. And hopefully we should be cool. Come on. One of these days. Okay, is it doing it? Still thinking. Okay. And there's our random white noise. Okay. So as I said, that's a little bit windy. But I hope that the way that I described it was effective. If you have any questions or anything about it, just drop me a line, drop me a message or a comment. Okay, and that's it for this tutorial. So next one, I think we're going to do try to move into generating like an actual sine wave. Okay, so hope you learned something from this tutorial, and I will see you next time.